So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Emily Pearson. I'm the founder and managing director at Our Minds Work, and we're here today with Jack and Rachel, who are going to explain all about themselves and the companies they work for. And we've joined forces to collaborate on a safeguarding people priority today. As you'll hear, we all come from a background where safeguarding is life when it comes to safeguarding people in the workplace and in our previous history of the work that we've done in health and social care and currently now in the work we do. So today is all about providing some information and guidance on a day in the life of mental health first aid initiatives versus what we call mental health advocate services. They are different things. So we are going to explain today what the difference is and why there's a difference and how we can ensure that when we are implying these initiatives, that safeguarding people is your priority. So there's a couple of ways you can interact with us today. Feel free to ask questions, talk to us in the chat box. Somebody will be in there at all times, checking in, answering any questions. And we will have questions at the end as well. So, we can run through those questions and talk about them in person. We are going to be running some anonymous polls today. So hopefully the poll should just appear on your screen. You can engage in the poll. I'm sorry if it doesn't happen. There's nothing at all we can do about it, but do feel free to pop any of your answers in the chat box if you still want to engage with that. You may feel like you want to use the toolbar today and use your annotate. So if you find where there is a toolbar that says Emily Pearson is sharing her screen, you will actually be able to see 3 little dots that says more of you, more options. If you actually click in there, you'll see a little pencil that says annotate. Feel free to pick a stamp and stamp away on my screen as we go throughout the day. This is a really great way to show us that you like what we're saying, or maybe you don't like what we're saying, or it's a question mark. Actually, I want to ask a question about this. It's just another way to get interactive with us today. So feel free to interact with us in those 3 ways. So we're just going to tell you a little bit about who we actually are. This is where I'm going to hand over to Jack.
Thank you very much, Emily. Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Jack Meller. My role is the managing director of a company called Personnel Checks. Some of you may be familiar with us. We are a nationwide background screening company with, I would say, a particular specialism in the subject of DBS checking. That being said, we provide a wide range of different types of checks, and we work with a huge range of organisations, both in the public and private sector, and across a range of different industries. Some of the more traditional industries that you would associate the topic of safeguarding with, like education, healthcare, medical, but some probably slightly non-traditional industries as well, where that notion of safeguarding is needed just as much. Personnel Checks is a relatively small but growing organisation of about 20 people, and we have a fantastic base in the north of England in Blackburn, and we have a team of safeguarding and background screening experts who are working all day every day to support our fantastic customers in helping them achieve those safer recruitment strategies that they are striving for. So we really aim to provide a fantastic service, expertise, and work together with customers to help them firstly implement that safeguarding policy and then provide the level of checks that it is that they will need on more of a practical level. So I'm really delighted to have been asked to speak today and really love working with both Rachel and Emily. And hopefully we're going to have a very productive session and conversation.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks very much, Jack. Rachel?
Hello, everybody. Hope you're all well. So yes, my name is Rachel Bishop. I am the owner of RLB Safeguarding Consultancy. My background has always been in safeguarding. I have worked in safeguarding for 15 years. So I started out in the prison, can't even talk today, prison, youth offending, drugs and alcohol, children's services for quite a number of years. I've worked in the NHS in mental health services. I've worked in the education system. So for me, you know, safeguarding has pretty much been an integral to every single part and every single role that I've done. And what I kind of found as I was growing up, I suppose, in the wonderful world of safeguarding, is that there were so many differences in different types of businesses regarding how they looked after their colleagues, how they looked after their clients, etc. So what I wanted to do is set up the business, which I did, to work with like-minded people who were wanting to implement something in the workplace. And I found myself massively involved in lots of different projects regarding mental health, especially around first aid initiatives and how best practices around safeguarding staff and implementing policies and procedures regarding that, lots of training and working with different businesses to see what their needs are and see how we can help them on with that path. Because safeguarding is always there, it's always somewhere, and it's an extremely important topic for people. So that is what I do. And again, thank you very much for having me today. And it's wonderful to work with the likes of Jack and Emily on all of the different projects that we're doing at the moment. So thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. And obviously I've introduced myself as founder and managing director of Our Minds Work. My experience and background covers a span of 20 odd years, and at about 15 years spent some time working with Rachel in the Young People's Drug and Alcohol Service together. So a long time working in health and social care from very, very diverse backgrounds, from secure environments, drug and alcohol services, young people, adults. So as you can imagine, safeguarding people has always been a priority when you're working in those types of services. Since moving into the workplace mental health sector around about 6 years ago, it became very, very evident that we were creating a very strong movement, and which was definitely needed to tackle stigma around mental illness and, you know, create an awareness to make sure that people receive the support that they needed to encourage recovery. However, one of the things that has happened over those times is what we've done is we've created a space in the workplace where initiatives have been implemented. And one of those implemented initiatives has been mental health first aid style initiatives. So when I'm talking about mental health first aid style initiatives, I'm actually talking about any type of mental health first aid. And it's not just Mental Health First Aid England who actually deliver mental health first aid training. So there are a range of them. And one of the things that we noticed a couple of years ago, once mental health first aid was being targeted and marketed into the workplace, it originally wasn't designed for the workplace. It was originally designed for communities to provide anybody in the community to have, to be more kind of mental health aware, but also potentially have the knowledge and skills to support somebody that they'd come across who may be experiencing an emotional crisis, and stay with them until, you know, emergency support was provided for that person. Now, if that happens in the community, that's brilliant. You know, you walk away and you probably never see that person again. But in the workplace, it's very, very different. These people, once they're put into mental health first aid roles, are classed as being a volunteer in a role. And there is policies and procedures and governance that need to be in place to make sure that everybody is kept safe. So that's a reason why we're actually here today. And Our Minds Work really exists to help to create mentally healthy workplaces with safeguarding as a priority for everybody. Okay, so then why are we actually here? And I'd like to know why you're here as well. We do have our first poll. So as I just mentioned there, we've already started to talk about some of the risks of poorly implemented and managed mental health first aid style initiatives. And generally what we've seen is 2-day training course. Who would like to be a mental health first aider? Put your hand up. Brilliant. There you go on a 2-day training course. Great, you're a mental health first aider now. Go away and do what you're expected to do. And what we've seen is we've seen two sides. We see that people will become so frightened because of the lack of support and training and guidance that they have, that they'll do nothing. Or you'll find that people may just go and do what they think is the best thing to do, which isn't always the safest or the right thing to do. So we need to make sure that everybody's safeguarded, from the business, from your volunteers who are giving their time and energy and effort up to support their peers and their peers themselves in the workplace. Over the past couple of years, as we have started to raise awareness and reduce stigma, we've seen the statistics actually increase around poor mental health and poor mental health in the workplace. So we know that there is employees in vast amounts of numbers in the UK workplace sector who are experiencing poor mental health, who do need access to support. So, you know, we know that there is a gap there in service. There's also a legal obligation. So when it comes to your legal obligation as an employer, you have the duty of care to protect the health and safety and well-being of your employees. And what we've seen when mental health first aid initiatives are poorly implemented, this could actually be breaching that duty of care. We want to deliver best practice here today. We want to make sure that you leave here today with knowledge around best practice to safeguard everybody in the workplace when it comes to mental health style initiatives. Anything else that you want to add there, Jack or Rachel, while I run our next poll?
Not from me, I think, yeah, just it's exactly as it is, and this is what is happening. And I think it's really important that people understand what their obligations are and understand what best practice looks like, so that they can then implement that in a safe way. And which is why, you know, we had the conversation originally, didn't we? And we said we wanted to do something like this. So please get involved, please share your thoughts. I'm just going to keep an eye on the chat box and whatnot. So yeah, thanks, Emily.
Thank you. Jack,
the only thing I'll add to that very quickly is, if everyone can try and keep in mind throughout the conversation to try and find the answer to the question, what one thing are you going to do after this meeting today, after this webinar today? Quite often it can just be that first step, which is the start or the continuation of a journey that you may be on. So I'm sure everyone on this webinar is at maybe different stages of their safeguard or culture creation project or whatever it's called internally. Some at the start, some in the middle, and some maybe towards the end. But hopefully this session today can just give one more component that you may not have considered, which will just make that culture all the stronger. So something to bear in mind whilst we're talking.
Thank you. So I have just launched our first poll. So the questions are, do you have mental health first aid trained people in your workplace? And I'm just saying mental health first aid because it could be mental health champions, mental health ambassadors, mental health advocates. They're all called something different depending on where you are working. Maybe yes, maybe no, or no, but you're actually planning on implementing this style of initiative. How many do you have? So it might be none if you're planning on it, less than 10, 10 to 50, 51 to 100, or maybe 100 plus. How did you recruit the volunteers? Was it just voluntary, expressed an interest and then trained? Did you ask people who you thought who would be good at the role? Maybe you had a clear formal recruitment process, or maybe you had a formal safe recruitment process. And we are going to discuss today what we mean by a safer recruitment process. Do you and your mental health first aiders know what responsibilities that you have, policies and procedures that their roles in the service is governed by? So this is a yes, a no, or actually maybe I'm not quite sure. Are you responsible for a group of mental health first aiders? Are you a mental health first aider advocate / champion yourself? Maybe you're a company director, safeguarding lead, or something else. Say what? I have noticed that there's a few mental health first aid trainers in here today. So I can imagine that a couple of those something else may just be that. And how much support, monitoring, reviewing and development do the group receive? None. We need to get better at this. Minimal. We meet now and again. We meet regularly, but we don't officially monitor or review the service. And we provide robust development, support, monitoring and reviewing of outcomes and safe practice of the service. So there's a lot there. I'm just going to give us few more moments just to complete those questions. While we're there, is there anything in the chat box so far, Rachel?
Nope. You're all quiet today.
Okay.
Oh, here. So student and volunteer, fabulous. Pleased to meet you. Oh, I've got a name.
Been a lot of chat about the weather.
Thanks, Carla.
You, Matt.
I've seen your message there. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire.
Okay.
Nice to see you.
So just a few more moments.
To say, and percentage of the number of staff trained might give a better indication. We've got 100% of staff trained, but that's less than 10. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, Debbie.
Should we dry run through?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mental health first aid instructor member, fabulous. Responsible for the MHFA network.
Good stuff. Great to hear. Brilliant. Okay. Just going to end the poll and share the results. So we have 80% in the room today saying that you do have mental health first aiders and 10% saying that you're planning on training them. How many people have you got trained? On average, we've got 50%, less than 10, but you know, quite surprisingly, we have two people with 51 to 100 and 4 people with 10 to 50. It's a lot of mental health first aiders. How did you recruit them? It was voluntary, expressed an interest, then trained, 55%. Only 5% have a formal safe recruitment process, and only 25% had a clear formal recruitment process. Do you and your mental health first aiders know what responsibilities you have, policies and procedures, and the roles in the service governed by it? Great to see that 55% are saying yes, but unfortunately there's still 45% saying no or I don't know. We have quite a number of mental health first aiders or advocates, etc., in the room today, which is great. Couple of company directors, so high level of responsibility for these people. Responsible for groups of mental health first aiders, 15%, you know, some safeguarding leads, brilliant. You know, this is great to see such a range of people here today interested in safeguarding their people. So how much support, monitoring and reviewing and development? So we have only 30% that actually provide robust development, support and monitoring, reviewing of outcomes and safe practice of the service. The majority of people are either not doing anything at all, doing very little, or you're not actually officially monitoring and reviewing the service. Thank you so much for being honest with that. They are anonymous polls, so I do think that it helps to be honest. One of the things that tells me is there are a small amount of people in this room who are probably doing what they should be, which means that there are a large amount of people in this room that are maybe just not quite there yet when it comes to making sure that safeguarding is a priority. So hopefully you are going to be inspired by some of the things that we discussed today. And when it comes to why we need to do this, you know, there are benefits to having mental health first aid and mental health advocate services if they're implemented and they're utilised in the safe and effective way. Some of those benefits include it helps people to gain early intervention, which means that there is a quicker recovery process. If we're not intervening until much later in that process towards mental ill health, then recovery becomes much harder. These initiatives can help to build trust, but they can also help to reduce stigma and discrimination, which links into building trust. It shows that the workplace is actually trying to tackle stigma and discrimination. They're actually acting on this. They have a well thought out service, which is very, very transparent. It's clear. It has policies and procedures. Everybody understands what it is. So that helps to build trust in the service, but also in the employer as well. It does increase mental health literacy and awareness, and not just for the people that have been on the mental health first aid or advocate course. The whole purpose of having mental health advocates for us is not that we're doing the kind of signposting, just the signposting when it gets to crisis. There is a huge opportunity to implement campaigns that raise awareness, that increase mental health literacy and increase signposting support for early intervention for people. It also helps us to create a suicide safer workplace. Who doesn't want that? Yeah, and obviously the volunteers in these roles want all of this as well. That's why they're doing it. no reasonable person would argue that if we want to achieve this and we want to protect everyone, that we need to be doing everything that we can to make sure that we're doing this safely. And as this week is actually volunteer week, you know, what a great time to actually celebrate the benefits of implementing these services and having these volunteers in the workplace. Thank you, Ashley, for giving us a couple of love hearts on there. It's really nice to see. Oh, I love little love hearts. So what we're kind of going to go into next is, look, we've looked at the benefits, we've looked at why we're here, we've actually seen through the polls some of the gaps that are actually there when it comes to implementing mental health first aid initiatives. And one of the gaps you may notice is that, does it actually fit into your mental health first aid? Does mental health first aid initiatives actually fit into your overall strategy? So what we can actually see here is the Our Minds Work culture change model. A lot of you may have seen this before if you've been to some of our events, because this is one of the things that is our role model that we try to provide intelligence for when it comes to culture change. So you can see across the top, we have a number of stages that takes a culture from at risk all the way through to inspiring culture. And obviously everybody wants to get to the green section. As you can see, I'm not going to go into this in detail, but we are going to talk today about peer-to-peer support. What you can see is that peer-to-peer support initiatives are quite far down when it comes to when they should be implemented. This is because we need to make sure that each of these stages are in place first before we're able to safely implement the peer-to-peer support service. This just makes sure that as we go, all these safety nets are in place. However, what we tend to see is that mental health first aid initiatives can be an easy thing to do. Can be quite easy to put a lot of people on a 2-day training course without doing some of the hard work first. You know, this stuff isn't easy, and it should never be easy when it comes to mental illness and safeguarding people. What you can also see from the peer-to-peer support section is we actually have mental health first aid initiatives where people have been trained, but with limited monitoring and support. So the majority of you in this room today, you're actually creating more of a risk than an organisation that hasn't put in a peer-to-peer support. So this is where we want to help you to get to today, is to better understand, you know, what are the risks of not actually implementing a systematic, safe and structured framework to make sure that it's fully embedded into your strategy and practice, where everybody is safeguarded, from the business down to the advocates and mental health first aiders and their peers as well. I am going to send this out to you in a follow-up email, so I will provide that so you can have a little bit of a look through it. Now I'm handing this over to Jack.
Yeah, thanks very much, Emily. Some really interesting thoughts in there. I'm sure some of the mental health first aid trained people on the call will be wanting to delve a little bit deeper into what it is you've just said there, and I promise you those answers are coming. But before we do that, in planning this webinar, we thought it was really important to frame the context in which we are discussing relevant topics today, and the broad umbrella which we can place over everything is, of course, safeguarding, but sometimes it is dangerous to look at safeguarding as a broad umbrella, and that notion of delving into the specific topics within them can be a very effective way of doing it too. The first thing that we want to look at is a way of coming up with a definition for safeguarding, and in our organization anyway, there are two that we use. The reason why we look for those two is because it's important to understand that safeguarding, in the way that it is explained and the way that that term is used, and a lot of what we're going to talk about today is around the notion of safeguarding vulnerable people. That may be a child who is by nature considered vulnerable, or a vulnerable adult in the way that they would be defined depending on which sort of definitions that you look at. So that very first piece of text we can see on the screen there, the action that is taken to promote the welfare of children and vulnerable people to protect them from harm. Obviously, the subjects within there, in the sense of children and vulnerable people, is absolutely key. But the two key words that we look around there are protection and prevention, which are two absolutely cornerstones of anybody's safeguarding policy. What I want to do is flip attention, however, to the second definition, which is a little more vague and does not necessarily invoke that idea of protecting people. I'll just read it out: a measure taken to protect someone or something, or to prevent something undesirable. In our nature of work, where we're looking at background checks and I guess compliance activities across the board, it is easy to fall into the trap of thinking that safeguarding is only about people, because sometimes who we're working with, the interaction with people is absolutely minimal. Sometimes safeguarding would allude to particular assets. It may be that you have a business and you want to protect things in there. You may have a till full of cash that's left overnight. You may have a safe that you only give certain people the code to. There may be keys to the premises that only certain people are trusted with. In our line of work, we help support businesses and recruitment decision makers make the safest possible recruitment decisions they can. And it's important to understand that that spans across a number of topics, but there is a huge emphasis, and I think a lot of what we're going to talk about today, that emphasis over those people who are working with children and vulnerable adults. And a key question that I'm sure we'll explore is, well, why would we go to these lengths and these efforts and this diligence to inform ourselves around a recruitment decision for somebody who is going to have access to our money box? And then why wouldn't we go through the same process as someone who's going to be dealing with mental health first aid courses, or dealing with interacting directly with children and vulnerable adults? So the context of those definitions, I think, are important to understand there. We just wanted to provide these very quick stats as well, because they are interesting. 2019 and 2020 comparisons in terms of the number of safeguarding concerns that have been reported to local authorities. I'm sure most of you will be aware here that local authorities all have some form of safeguarding initiatives happening within them. The number of cases that were reported were up 5% in 2019, and up to a really positive number, 14.6 in 2020. So what encourages people like me, people like Rachel, people like Emily, is that something is starting to happen. Things are starting to work. People are starting to take note of this. And the fact that we're all on this call today is a great thing. However, we are firmly of the belief that even more can be done, and even more corners and pockets and things we've not even discovered yet can be delved into further. So the stats on a high level are encouraging, but we still feel there is definitely a long way to go. I hope that was useful. I hope that makes sense.
Thanks, Jack. And I think just to push the point forward when it comes to mental health first aid style initiatives, there are a number of ways that people can become vulnerable in the workplace, especially if they're at risk of significant harm from themselves or others, especially if somebody in the workplace is experiencing a psychosis, they're unable to keep themselves safe. So to say that those things are never going to happen, it's just ridiculous, because it does actually happen. Those things do happen. So we need to make sure that we are protecting people, thinking about, those things that do happen. And when we talk about children, when it comes to the workplace, how many of you as an organisation here have apprentices who are school leavers, who would be classed as kind of children and young people? And how do you know that those mental health first aiders aren't actually going to come into contact with those people as well, especially if they're seeking help around their mental health? It may be that they report that their mental health is poor because of abuse or neglect. We really need to take a helicopter view of safeguarding when it comes to mental health first aid style initiatives. So thanks so much for giving us a bit of an introduction there. So we're going to move on now to the nitty-gritty of it. How do you actually safely implement a mental health first aid style initiative? I'm going to just swap over my screen here to our infographic, and I will send this out to you so that you get to see it. This is kind of a mental health first aiders versus mental health advocates. Like I said, for us, the mental health advocate role is what we're going to be talking about here today, because it's part of a service that you provide for your peers. Mental health first aiders generally tend to be people who've been on a mental health first aid training, but actually aren't classed as being recruited safely, don't have ongoing support, they're not being monitored, they're not working to safeguarding and other policies and procedures. So as you can see here, our mental health first aiders versus mental health advocates, the way that I like to kind of think about this is, you know, you've said, this is a brilliant idea. We need to provide peer-to-peer support around mental health in our workplace. Mental health first aiders, who would like to be a mental health first aider? Put your hand up. Brilliant. We'll send you on a load of training. Now go out and do your job. Visually, if you think about these people that you've just trained, imagine they've been on this training. They're all stood outside in the car park. It's raining, it's windy, they don't know what they're supposed to be doing, they've got no protection, there's no infrastructure around them to house them. And then all your colleagues are walking past these people going, why are they stood in the car park in the rain? I don't know, something strange going on there. Let's kind of steer clear of that. So we can actually see that when there's minimal training, no additional support, no infrastructure, it actually puts people at risk. And they also are very, very unclear on what their role and responsibilities are and how to carry them out. When it comes to running a mental health advocate service and by safely implementing them, this is a completely different way. We make sure that the infrastructure is in place before we even go through the safer recruitment process. The service has a very, very clear aim and objectives. So the way that we can think about this is, when it comes to running a mental health advocate service in a safe and effective way, the correlation between our mental health first aiders in the rain in the car park is your mental health advocates are actually in the car park too, but they're housed within a building. That building is providing protection, it has the infrastructure. Because the service has a very clear aim and objectives and it's marketed well, it has transparency, people are able to walk past the building and look in the window and it'll say, welcome, we're mental health advocates. This is our role. This is what we're here to do. This is a confidential service unless we hear something that puts you or someone else at risk, then we would breach confidentiality. And this is what that means. So it becomes very, very clear to people if they want to use that service or not, just by looking in the window. What we can also do is make sure that we provide access points, which are doors. We call them windows and doors when we're setting up a service. These access points are very clear points of access that are there to keep people safe. So if we have a building having 50 access points to this building, we're not going to be able to manage it. It's going to be uncontrollable. And when we actually think about keeping the mental health advocates safe, one of the ways that we need to think about this is actually psychological injuries specifically to themselves when it comes to trauma. You know, at the end of the day, once you open your doors to a service, you have no control over what people are going to come and talk to mental health advocates about. So we have a specific process in place to actually keep those people safe. One of the reasons why I set up this blueprint to provide a service like this was based on setting up a counselling service. You know, even in a counselling service with heavily trained therapists, we would always do a triage, and that is to make sure that the client gets the right level of service, but also that we're protecting our therapists. So for example, we ask, you know, why is it that you want to speak to a therapist? And if one of those reasons is bereavement, but our therapist doesn't do bereavement therapy for specific reasons, they may have had past trauma themselves around bereavement, then we wouldn't match that person together. So we're actually opening up a space here where if there is no kind of triage or service in place to make sure that people are being kept safe, this can actually re-trigger old trauma for people as well. There is another element to this, as you can see with the policies and procedures. You as an employer are there to provide this kind of governance to keep people safe. It's part of your duty of care. Just because people are now in a role as a mental health first aider does not mean that they are now not obliged to continue to make sure that policies and procedures to keep people safe are adhered to. One of those policies and procedures that Rachel's here to talk about today is your safeguarding policy and procedure, and how implementing this as part of your service should be seen as, you know, kind of number one aim and best practice. Rachel? Oh, what happened there?
You just froze like completely outright.
Where did I get up? Where did you hear us get up to?
You got up to policies, and then I started talking about why it's important to have a policy in place.
Oh, I'm very sorry about that. I'm sorry, everyone. Let me just reshare this. I don't know what happened there. It just all went funny. There you go. Thanks, Rachel.
No worries, no worries. I was literally just saying, you know, from our perspective of what we've seen when we've been working with different businesses, the first actual point before any of these things are implemented is that they have a robust safeguarding policy, a comprehensive safeguarding policy that really delves into the fact of what safeguarding is, around those definitions that Jack kindly went into, around any particular legislation that you actually are, you know, subject to, it dependent on what type of company or industry you work for, etc., what sector. And then from that perspective, you're outlining that it's about having a really robust position statement so people understand exactly what you are telling them as a business we will be doing for people. It's about that confidentiality. It incorporates everything around staff allegations. It talks about safeguarding in general and enlightens people about some different types of abuse. And then it kind of really gives it weight when it's got a really robust procedure in place. If you don't have a reporting procedure and then you move forward from that policy to say, well, this is what happens in that event, there's, you know, a form that you fill out or whatever, there's a person that manages that. Unfortunately, you're going to get into the sticky situation of you're out there, there's no policy to cover you, and you're working with people who may be divulging this information to you. And if you've had no decent training, if you've had no understanding or awareness around safeguarding as a general factor, then if somebody stood in front of you telling you that they want to take their own life, what kicks in for you then? Do you understand that there is a policy there? Has it been trained out effectively to your organisation? And if not, it's quite a scary place to be. It's really frightening. And I think then there's all the different issues around confidentiality, and you haven't got something robust that's there, that is your infrastructure and your governance. Then how are you supposed to know how to act in those situations, and what's the aftermath? Do you know? And I'm sure Emily's going to talk quite significantly about that as she goes on. However, it's about, if you don't have that infrastructure in the beginning, where are we going to go with this? Are we going to record incidents? What do you record? What don't you? You know, all of that information around that. So it's so integral that you have this policy in place to understand as a whole business, from board level up to, you know, any person in there, from all your volunteers, to understand what to do in that form of crisis, so that you're protecting that person, which is the first and foremost thing, but also then you're protecting yourself if you're an advocate or you're a first aider or a designated safeguarding lead, whatever. And having been in all of those roles, you know, I wouldn't have a clue what to do if somebody hadn't given me the expertise that I've got, and, you know, my background and understanding around safeguarding, went on copious training courses and haven't written policies, you know, to really understand that. So it's crucial, guys. It's the main thing that you need to be thinking about if you want to implement any kind of initiative like this. I'll be quiet now.
Thanks, Rachel. No, absolutely. I do have a couple of stories of incidents where we've had clients come to us. They weren't our clients, but they've come to us specifically because they've had safeguarding issues that haven't been dealt with properly, and that has been because there was no safeguarding policy and procedure and it hadn't been trained out. So we've had a number of incidents that I can kind of share with you, and you know, they're actually quite frightening. If we look at it from a health and safety perspective, a lot of these have been actually near misses that could have went very, very wrong. And when we look at mental health in the workplace, I think there's currently something about, there's around 800,000 mental health first aiders, mental health advocates actually trained in the workplace. Now, even if only 5% of those people are actually talking around safeguarding and suicide, that's around 30,000 people, 30,000 conversations where this is happening and they're not being recorded, they're not being acted on appropriately, and these safeguarding risks are being missed. So one of the situations I can tell you about was an HR manager got in contact with us one day, absolutely in a panic. One of their mental health first aiders had spoken to a colleague who'd said that they were thinking of suicide. And after a 10-minute conversation, that person then said, I've kind of changed my mind a little bit and I'm not going to go away and hurt myself. And that mental health first aider allowed that person to leave that room. Even with decades of working in health and social care, speaking to thousands of people that have been in crisis, I would never have allowed that person to leave that room. I would have passed it on to probably the crisis team or emergency services. They are the professionals to make that call. So when we actually look at the near misses, that person left and could have actually gone home and took their own lives. Quite luckily, they'd actually told a manager instead. And just that day, we had delivered some manager training and actually talked about breaching confidentiality when someone's at risk of significant harm. And it was the manager who actually took that confidentiality and breached it to HR. So there's a very, very clear near miss of what happens when you don't have a clear policy and procedure and people don't have the right level of training to be confident in these situations. We're also working with another client at the moment who came to us because one of their clients had told somebody in their business that they were thinking of suicide. So we're now helping them to put in place some training and policy and procedure. So whether it's a client who is, disclosing, whether it's an employee, it doesn't matter. This is about safeguarding people, no matter who those people are. So then this kind of leads us into the safer recruitment. Once we've got the infrastructure in place, our building looks lovely outside, it has all the policies and procedures, we know exactly what our aims and objectives are, we're ready to launch our service, we need to make sure that we get the right people in that service. When it comes to this type of role, we're talking about people who are going to be engaging with people in the workplace who are experiencing mental illness, who've experienced trauma, who are experiencing abuse, neglect themselves, maybe be deemed as vulnerable. That to me is an extremely important, but obviously a very, very difficult role to be in without the clear guidance to support them. So we need to make sure that we're providing safer recruitment. And when we talk about safer recruitment, just putting people on a mental health first aid training course after they've put their hand up and said, I want to do this, just isn't good enough. What we should be doing is making sure that we have clear role and responsibilities. There's probably people in here today who are responsible for recruitment. You don't recruit just by saying, come along if you would like to do this job. We working in health and social care, working with vulnerable people, you never get a job just by going, oh, I'd like to do that. You've got this really robust formal application and recruitment process. So this should be in place, and we're actually including DBS checks with regards to this. Just because somebody says that they want to be a mental health first aider does not mean that they should be and that they're the right person to be in that role. I need to make that really clear. And sometimes it can be a difficult thing to think about because we think, oh, that's brilliant, really, really great that you want to be a mental health first aider. We can't trust people to be safe in these roles without actually checking and making sure we're providing everything to keep them safe as well.
Can I just
if I could,
Emily?
Yeah.
I was just going to sort of add on as well, just as well for anyone who is in that recruitment, position. It's not just about your checks as well, but actually the suitability. So something that I've definitely come across in many businesses that I've worked in sort of roles as head of safeguarding and stuff like that, and also head of HR, I came across lots of volunteers in huge organisations that put their hands straight up and fantastic, and kudos to them, had all of the right kind of reasons of why they wanted to do it, but actually we're so not right for that role, just in terms of kind of maybe their own experiences, the projection of that onto other people, people driving their own initiatives forward as opposed to actually listening to the people and all of that. So that's really about, I always interview, for anything, whether it's a champion role or whatever, and I would always have a really nice set of questions that I would be asking people, and just to assess the suitability. And you can do that very quickly by having a real conversation. If you're not doing that and you're just accepting somebody on the face value that they want to be that person, which again, absolutely lovely, and have all of the credit in the world for people like that. But do they understand the danger? Do they understand kind of where they get to? So yeah, it's just something to be very mindful of, and I think Jack's going to elaborate on that. So
yeah, if I may come in there, Rach, actually this is so relevant to the world of DBS checking, because safer recruitment is a strategy which has a number of stages along it, and DBS checking vetting is clearly one of the ones that is placed at the start. You wouldn't invest time, energy, money and commitment into finding the right person, doing your checks right at the very end and having wasted a lot of time. So it's firstly important to place that at the start from a practicality and logistical point of view. It just makes sense. But one of the questions that we get asked the most is, oh, okay, great. We've done the checks. You've given us the results. What do we do with that information now? And unfortunately, we and a lot of our peers in the industry of the world of background screening, we're not in a position to cross that threshold of telling you how to make a decision. However, one of the things that is absolutely crucial in DBS checking particularly is that anyone carrying out a DBS check, so if anyone on this call has ever requested a DBS check, you should have also been pointed towards a document which is very short and easy to read online. It's called the DBS Code of Practice. And one of the real key components within that is that notion of suitability. So the word you choose there, Rachel, was absolutely correct. And the DBS Code of Practice states that any company carrying out DBS checks at any level must have a suitability policy to support the entire process. So it's not just a tick box exercise to say, we've done the checks. And on the other end of that spectrum, it's not just a case of, we'll do checks and anyone who's clear, we'll hire them, and anyone who's not clear, we won't hire them. You've got to find that spectrum in the middle. It's about giving people an opportunity to work and to do the right thing and to get their life back on track if they have made a mistake in the past. But balancing that out with protecting the vulnerabilities that you have within your organization, should that be cash, keys, or what we're talking about here today, which is invariably those vulnerable people. So I think you've touched on something really, really key there. So I just wanted to reinforce that point. That notion of suitability is critical and something that so many people get wrong. So I would encourage you to Google DBS Code of Practice, Google suitability policy. If you don't have one and you're doing DBS checks, you need to get one in place.
Thanks, Jack. I think as well, just kind of looking at your slide there about what is checked under the volunteer section there, if you went to work at your local mental health charity, just as, somebody who would be in a style of kind of mental health first aid type of role, you would have to do a check. You would have to be, it would need to be an enhanced check to make sure that you were able to keep those people safe. For some strange reason, when it comes to the workplace, we've just completely forgotten about the best practice and actually legal obligation of keeping people safe. when it comes to health and social care, especially when people are experiencing mental health problems, young people who you may also have in the workplace, people who may be vulnerable because of a disability that you have in the workplace, all of those people work in workplaces, yet we've completely forgotten about keeping those people safe when it comes to these type of mental health first aid volunteers. So that, you know, really, really great to push that point across. Thank you. So then just going back over to implementing this safe service, you know, we want you to be able to relax knowing that your advocates are trained and checked. When we talk about mental health first aid advocate versus mental health first aid, we need to think about what's the right training for the role. So what are you doing to onboard these people once they've gone through the process and they've been trained? And then how do we make sure that they've got ongoing support, training and development? But then are we actually monitoring them as well to make sure that we're running a safe, effective service? So I do have a little bit of a kind of comparison sheet here. The mental health first aid style training are these little ticks, what it tends to provide. And these are the three boxes are basically what our mental health advocate training provides, what our mental health advocate service blueprint and support for implementation provides, and what our mental health advocate membership provides. So as you can see, in comparison to your general 2-day mental health first aid, you can see how we're actually covering everything that we've talked about so far to ensure that throughout this whole process, those volunteers are safe, they're effective, the business is safe, the peers are safe, and everybody is provided with the support that they need to implement this safe peer-to-peer support service. This kind of just leads us into monitoring and reviewing. You know, what is the point in doing anything if you're not going to monitor and review it? Especially when it comes to keeping people safe, but also for intelligence, to how we can actually engage some of the data of how the service is being used to think about, you know, what's our next campaign. You don't need to stick to every mental health campaign that is put across kind of mainstream. You may have found that because of the monitoring that you're doing, that over the past couple of months, a lot of peers have been accessing the support because of a restructure. You know, you can then use your service to provide information and guidance to people when they're part of that restructure. You could actually use it to offer building emotional resilience training to people going through that situation and process. So actually utilizing intelligence from your service helps you to plan ahead. It also helps you to show how effective it is, especially when signposted to different services. So if you have an EAP in place and you're collecting data and 100 contacts with your mental health advocates, and they've all said, yeah, I've signed, where have you signposted to? Signposted to a men's mental health service and signposted to our EAP. You can then correlate it with your data from your employee assistance program to see if people who referred, not actually people who were referred, because you won't be able to see that data, it's confidential on who the individuals were, but you'll be able to look at a correlation between how many referrals were made and how many people actually contacted that service that month. So you can start to look at how you're actually increasing opportunities into recovery, utilising some of your other services as well. Obviously, we need to keep people safe. One of the things that we hear time and time again is when we talk to mental health first aiders, and because they've had no clear guidance on their role and responsibilities, when we start talking to us, tell us a little bit about what the contact's like for you when you speak to peers. Oh, well, you know, sometimes, you know, we have a good chat for about an hour. Sometimes I'll plan to see them for a couple of weeks afterwards. An hour is a counselling service. You know, this is not a counselling service. This is a listening and signposting service. So it should only take around 20 minutes to listen and signpost people to the right service that they need. What we also know is that if people are actually planning to meet them week after week after week, this starts to create attachment, and this can be very, very difficult to manage and deal with. So what we also need to make sure that we're doing is that we're providing the right support for people through that signposting service. This shouldn't be a revolving door service. It's a listening and signposting service. If people come back to your service, they weren't signposted to the right support previously, or there's something missing there. So being able to monitor and review all of this data will help to make sure that it's been safe, it's effective, you're using your intelligence, and you're actually collecting data which can then be fed back to the wider organisation and your executive team to show that it's working and it has a return on investment as well. I hope that makes sense. I am going to send out this infographic to yourselves so that you have it there, just as a little reminder. And this is the impact of actually doing it the right way. It may be a little bit longer and it may take a little bit more time and energy and effort, but as you can see, the risks are definitely worth it. One of our clients, Newcastle City Council, who we worked with through this whole blueprinting and membership programme service, have actually given us some sound bites to cover through today. So this is from David Luke, who's the wellbeing lead, and from Kathy Waff, who was the organisational development lead specialist. I'm just going to let you read through some of those because there's quite a few quotes there, and I'll kind of read out some of my, really, really powerful ones for me. I think the second one there, so the blueprint, which is what we've just kind of gone through there with your, it's obviously broader than that, but this is the kind of key objectives to it. The blueprint provides the framework of best practice for effectively and safely setting up and running a mental health advocate service for our colleagues. Marrying it with our organisation's current infrastructure was tricky, but not everything that is worthwhile is easy to do. So yes, it is a little bit harder to do, but when it comes to mental health, it shouldn't be a tick box. I think what's really kind of important to say also, just with some of those quotes, is the third one down, which covers about safeguarding policies and procedures here. Obviously, Newcastle City Council have safeguarding policies and procedures in place, absolutely. But what we found during the blueprint procedure was that they were all aimed at service users, clients rather than colleagues. So we had to support them to actually align the safeguarding policy and procedure with the processes for the mental health advocates, especially where disclosure had been made with a risk of suicide or significant harm exposed. Now it's extremely clear. Everybody knows where it is. They know how to manage the situations. They know where to report them. And there's a reporting mechanism to make sure those situations are reviewed. And it also includes making sure that the people who've gone through that situation have somebody to speak to, whether it's the colleague who was going through the crisis or the mental health advocate. Safeguarding is a specialist service. That's why we don't deliver safeguarding, and that is why we work with Rachel to ensure that all of our clients have access to that support. So I'm just going to hand over to Jack just to do a little bit of a summary now, as we're getting close to the end and we want time for questions.
Thanks, Emily. So just a quick overview really of how we would recommend going about implementing safeguarding in the workplace. Remember, we're tackling this from a background screening perspective. So the very first thing to say is that I think it would be quite rare to find one partner to help you do it all. And I think it's important to strengthen your connections, strengthen your network, and work with the safeguarding professional who may be a consultant or who may be a company providing service that works for you. We have an understanding of the broad picture, and we've broken it down into 3 key steps really. The first one around making safer recruitment choices through appropriate background screening. This is one component part of that wider safer recruitment strategy that I talked about earlier. I mentioned it's a process with a number of different stages, and it's important to ensure that safety is a thread that is woven through your pre-existing recruitment policies and procedures, to really look at strengthening that. Recruitment is not just posting jobs and interviewing people and then offering them jobs. It goes so much wider than that, and there is a much deeper level, just on a pure recruitment level, but then there's another deeper level when you add the notion of safe recruitment in there as well. What I would encourage people to do is to head to the NSPCC website on this. They have some fantastic resources that are freely available for you to embrace this type of stuff yourself. But otherwise, feel free to reach out to me for background screening side of things specifically, and I'm sure Rachel on the safeguarding, safer recruitment policy, more generally, if you'd like to take that knowledge a little bit further. That component of background screening, I think I touched on it earlier a little bit in everything I was talking about with regard to a suitability policy, but just to give a very brief overview, as recruitment decision makers, what you need in order to be able to make those decisions and I think remain true to the policies that you write and to make sure that they're fully embodied and they don't just sit on the shelf, is you need information in front of you to be able to make that decision. And at Personnel Checks, that is our entire mission and purpose, is focused around putting a varied amount of information in front of you, a varied and relevant amount of information in front of you as a recruitment decision maker in the easiest way possible. So DBS checks are critical, it's true, and that is because the Disclosure and Barring Service themselves are a well-structured organization, and they can provide a framework for a standardized way of looking at people's criminal records in a safe and appropriate and legislatively compliant way. However, there are other additional checks that we can add into those packages to make your entire recruitment decision-making process a more comprehensive and varied one altogether. So if you're interested in knowing if people are being truthful on their CVs about their qualifications, if you're interested in knowing if people are safe to be driving around in vehicles which may contain vulnerable passengers, and if you're wanting to know if people are in any financial trouble and they may start to take advantage of their position of authority within your business to do with financial matters, those are the types of things that you can find out by implementing it into your safer recruitment procedure altogether. So I'd be delighted to speak to anybody personally or individually after the webinar to go into some more detail on that. The second component there is one of many tools that we can look at in the context of safeguarding in the workplace, but implementing a mental health advocate framework for your existing staff, as Emily has so passionately described on the webinar prior to what I'm saying now, is just an absolute no-brainer these days. And I think that embracing that idea that it's not just the people who put their hands up who are the right people to do it, we've got to start considering the mental health advocates, the mental health champions, whatever the terminology is that you're using, we've got to consider them as these key people who need the relevant recruitment and suitability decision making on them as well. And finally, ensuring you have those comprehensive safeguarding policies and procedures in place. It's a suite of policies, in my opinion. It's a number of documents, it's a number of components that are going to really help bring the activities that you're doing to life and tie it all together and make sure that it's not just a question of immediately not trusting people. It's just a level of saying, these are where the standards are for our business, and you've got to work with those and you've got to achieve those. You've got to collaborate with us on those in order to be part of our organization, because this is what we do. This is how we lay out the land, and it's fair for everybody. And we'll work together to see if you will be a good fit for our business, to see if you be suitable for our business. But I think most importantly, in the context of what we're talking about today, will you be safe for our business? If you can answer those questions, you are well on the way to implementing safeguarding in the workplace.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about solving the safeguarding issue. And I think I've just kind of pulled off a few main points from my perspective of what I've seen, what obviously is part of my experience in terms of that safeguarding world. So I thought I'd just pop a few up there for you in terms of that solving Okay, so as I've already gone on about it, it's about having a comprehensive safeguarding policy, and just to sort of echo what Jack said around that suite of policies, which can encompass safer recruitment processes and everything. So it's understanding what your obligations are. Oops, sorry. Hello? No, bro, I thought somebody was asking a question. Okay, so if you start out, you're thinking about, well, actually, we don't have anything in our business at the moment. We don't have a policy. We don't really understand what our obligations are. We don't understand what, some of the legislation might be. Where on earth do we start? Okay, it is definitely in that respect useful to go to somebody who does know how to do that. If not, and you're feeling brave and you can, do that research and do a bit of project management in terms of what you would need, do the research and understand that. Sometimes it then just needs to be that comprehensive piece that says, we care about our staff, our colleagues, our customers, whatever kind of route you want to go down. This is what our legislation says, and this is what we need to abide by in terms of what our obligations are and our responsibilities. As an employer, our responsibilities are around safeguarding people, anyone, that encompasses everyone, volunteers, contractors, whatever. Okay, so it just has that broad horizon around who we're looking after. Then it falls into the place of, well, what are we looking after? Okay, so people really need to understand that ongoing and training and development piece is so crucial. We need a person in the business that is going to have a bit of time. I think some of the things that I see quite regularly is usually the head of HR, the HR director, HR officers. It will be a discussion that they would then encompass this role and sort of have it as a bit of a dual role. Do they have the time? Not usually. Do they have the resource? Not always. And do they have the sort of mindset to be able to really take this on board and understand? So having a really robust training schedule for your year, and it's ongoing, it's not just a one-off, it's not just a tick box, to actually really understand what safeguarding is. Something really important in the work that I do is what is safe, like what is an issue? Do you know what I mean? What classifies as a safeguarding issue, and what then would we do in terms of moving that forward around your procedure? So having that training and development and having that understanding and that position statement really forges the way for a business, for a company, for whoever, to say, well, actually, this is what we're about, and we want to look after you. I mean, I'm more than sure I'd see everyone's hand go up. People want to work somewhere good. We spend a lot of time there, most of our lives, and we're sat in an environment where we need to feel safeguarded. So just one, I'm just going to go a little bit off piece here, but for instance, a person, it could be a young lady, it could be a young man, going through some significant domestic abuse at home. They're trying to hold it together, they're in work, they're present, it's that presenteeism, but they're not quite engaging with everything. They're sat there thinking, I can't do this work, I can't concentrate, I am in a really bad place. Okay, there could be children at home, which obviously leads to another safeguarding issue, because they could be witness or could be subject to some of that domestic abuse. And then what happens? Mental health deteriorates. That person is in a really bad place mentally, and is sat in front of you potentially trying to work, trying to hold down a job, worried about financials, worried about everything. And it becomes so engrossed in the fact that, they can't operate. They're worried about making a mistake. They don't want the business to kind of falter in terms of what they're trying to deliver on. So can you imagine the pressure? That there might be stress. Obviously, there might be a stress policy that somebody could be adhering to support that person. They may be in one-to-ones with their manager. But what else? How are we moving this forward? And I know a lot of people, particularly clients that I speak to at the beginning, are just like, well, I don't know what the heck we would do with something like that. Where would I even start? Is it any of my business? Safeguarding is everybody's business. So that responsibility falls into that policy, into that training and development for people to understand, well, nobody needs to be an expert. I've done it for years and years and years. It comes very, very naturally. I have incidents outside of work, people could contact me, and it kicks in. It's an automatic response, okay, is what I'm trying to say to you, because it's a learned experience, and I understand safeguarding because it's been my bread and butter for years and years and years. For other people, it is not that. Okay, it is absolutely frightening. So to be sat in front of somebody who is sat saying, I can't cope, I'm in a position where I don't dare go home, but I don't want to be at work because I'm not coping. My mental health is so bad, I am thinking about suicide. Okay. Where do we understand how we move that forward? Where do we say, well, actually, what are our obligations to this person? Do we breach confidentiality? That person is sat in front of you and they are at significant risk of harm, okay? Potentially other people as well, including potential for children. You have to do something about that. If you don't have a policy that tells you what you do in those scenarios, how would you know what to do? If you don't have somebody who you can go to as a fountain of knowledge within that business, you're in sticky territory, really. So I always say,
Rachel, if I may just come in there a second, I think what you're saying is so powerful. There's a really interesting comment that's come in through the chat here from Lorraine. Thanks, Lorraine, for the comment.
Okay.
She's compared what you're talking about to the notion of it being like CPR for mental health. Have you ever heard that analogy before?
Yeah, I actually have. Yeah, I actually have. So thanks for that. And I think that is in its finest essence. You've got to just act, don't you? You've just got to have a plan.
Yes.
That is your procedure. That is all that it is. It's just a procedure to say, is this person at significant risk of harm? Is it something where somebody's going to get really, really hurt? Do I need to ring emergency services now, or does this need to be a referral of a service that can support that person? And it's making that decision. But how can people be expected to do that without the right credentials, the right suitability, all of that, isn't it, Jack?
I'm not
around that person.
Yeah, and I'm not first aid trained in the traditional sense of the word.
Yep.
And if I needed to perform CPR on somebody, I would sort of know that I need to do that, but I wouldn't know how to do it. I don't have the technique. I've not been trained, but there may be someone in the room who does, and it's making sure that that person is in the room. The way I've looked at it, I think we've always had that innate. We've always looked at it as explaining it in a way to say everyone's got that innate sense of something's not quite right here when the sort of the hairs on the back of your neck sort of stand up and you sort of think, I need to take some action here. But what is that? And in a nutshell, I think safeguarding can come down to arming people with the proportionate and relevant actions that they can take or need to take, which is sometimes just telling somebody else who knows what to do.
Of course. But you'd rather know that, wouldn't you? You'd rather have 100%. Something that shows you that guidance, having that infrastructure, and it needs to go up to your executive, to your board level, because there needs to be a buy-in around that sort of cultural piece. And I always talk about a culture of vigilance and safeguarding being everybody's responsibility. If I was sat having a glass of wine with my friends and one of them said the same, are you going to just go home and not tell anybody? It's just that kind of analogy, I think. And what we're trying to say is this isn't easy, but we're not expecting you to be experts. Nobody is expected to walk away from some training or whatever and feel so competent and confident, because it takes practice, which is really sad, because you're going to have to go through some scenarios before you feel confident sometimes. But what you've got when you've got a safeguarding policy and a procedure that documents exactly what needs to happen in some of these crisis modes or whatever's kind of going on in terms of these safeguarding situations, it just broadens your horizon. Okay, so we Emily and I spoke to a company a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about they had a really robust safeguarding policy in place. They work in that industry where it's a given, as you said, with Newcastle City Council and whatnot. But we wanted to map it over, and we were trying to broaden the sort of picture around safeguarding so people could pick up on other issues. But actually it makes no difference what you pick up on. The policy and the procedure is always the same. You pick up the phone to either the relevant agency, or you're going to call somebody and say, this is the current situation, who are you going to put me in touch with? And they'll make that decision. So it's just that passing on of information, but it's all about the timely response. So getting it right, getting that timely response in place, and making sure that we need to drive that forward, but learn from it, exactly like Emily said. So capturing those records. What did you do to support that person? What's your follow-up? Who did you tell? Who was the social worker, or who was the crisis member that came out? all of those different things. It's so important. I've heard a lot of stories recently, some very, very sad stories about different businesses in the Manchester area and some employees who did unfortunately take their own life. And I think it's so pertinent now that people are picking up on this, whether it's a work related issue or not. Some people think it's just, well, should we just support them around work related stress and stuff like that? Well, we live at home, don't we? Lots of people are working from home now, a lot more than we used to. You may be on a Zoom meeting, you may be on a Teams call and see something in the background. It's just about that vigilance and openness. You can't go far wrong by being vigilant and open and looking after each other, but also looking after yourself, okay? I think it's really important as well to understand that, as adults, if we're not talking about children or apprentices, as adults, we can make very poor decisions, that put us in some very risky positions. I'm talking about your substance misuse, I'm talking about other things. So we have an obligation to ourselves as well as each other. Mental health first aid or mental health advocate initiatives, whatever we're calling it for the purpose of today. So I know a lot of people have come from different backgrounds. It's imperative that we have this, and that is underpinned exactly by what Emily said around that strategy. What is your strategy? How are you going to move that forward in your business? How are you going to incorporate some kind of support system? So things like your employee assistance programs, what have you got in place that's going to protect people? And make it accessible, make it known. How are you going to market that? How are you going to campaign that within your business to understand that people are okay with, I can pick up that phone and have a conversation with a potential therapist if I need to. That's wonderful. Do people buy into that? It's only as good as when you actually implement it and you get, down to the ground and it becomes a cultural thing. So, in any roles I've had previously, you'll hear me bang on about it several thousand times, but what I've then see, is a shift. So being, employee wellbeing sort of manager and stuff like that, you see a shift of people actually picking up the phone to talk, and it just drives you forward in terms of that. So I think from my perspective, it's just about getting that right. It's about incorporating that into a policy and understanding exactly when you're moving that forward, how you're going to implement it, what you're going to do with it. And when you've got that culture and you're thinking about mental health in its finest essence and saying, we know it's here, we want to reduce that stigma, but we want you to pick up the phone if you need something. You're not in a frightening place if you've got all of these things in stored. You know what I'm saying? You know where to go. So yeah, it's quite a big task. I appreciate that for people. But if anyone does want to have a chat with me, I'm always available. Just get in touch with me, and I could talk about kind of your businesses. I always offer a bit of a consultation with people that have a talk about their business need and see if it's something that would be helpful. So I will stop talking now.
Thanks, Rachel. Just gives us enough time for questions. I am going to send out Rachel and Jack's details as well. I know we've answered some questions in the chat box. Has anyone got any further questions that you would like to unmute yourself or ask or have a conversation around before we just kind of finish off for the day? I just wanted to make sure that we got time for questions in there. I think one of the things to also say here is Rachel and I talking about this because we've done it for decades and decades and decades. It's been, you live and breathe your safeguarding policy and procedure, which includes everything. I think two things to take away from today is you only know what you know. And I don't think that I've seen anyone in here today who would be classed as a mental health or safeguarding expert or have a level of experience and knowledge and know how to actually implement all these things that we're talking about today. So you only know what you know. But also what I'd also like you to think about as you kind of leave here today is if you don't do these things, what's the worst that could happen? And if that happened, how could you live with that, knowing what you know now of actually the processes and procedures that should be in place to keep everybody safe and make safeguarding a priority in your workplace? Are there any questions? Sorry, I've just got a new laptop and I can't.
There is a question.
Yeah, there is.
That's just come from Lorraine again.
Okay.
It is on the topic of mental health, so maybe best directed at you, Emily.
Okay.
Lorraine's asked that she has an upcoming all staff meeting and the theme is mental health. We do have a great EAP in place, but how do we address the topic in a way that can be received with open minds?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question, isn't it? We put mental health on the agenda without really understanding how do we do all of this stuff. I think one of the things that we can do to help to build trust and tackle stigma is to be safe in how we're actually sharing this information. So, you know, who's sharing the information around mental health? What's the topic that you're covering? What's the aim? What's the objectives? If you do raise awareness in this meeting, how do you make sure that people have the right level of support if they come forward and say, actually, I've been affected by that and I need some help? You know, one of the things that we notice a lot happens when it comes to mental health in the workplace is, if you go back to our progression model, you remember that we said to start at the top, where we start off with policies, procedures, making sure we've got safeguarding in place, making sure managers have had training, we know what we're doing around work-related stress, etc., etc. Employee awareness is actually at the bottom, because if you start with delivering employee awareness first and you haven't gone through all these additional steps, you can actually leave people in a harder position when it comes to their recovery, because they then go, and I need some help, and actually the help isn't there. You know, it's great to have an employee assistance process in place, but does the manager have the right level of training and skills and tools and confidence to actually provide support for that employee while they're at work? So, you know, there's all of these areas that they need to work together in a fully well thought out strategy, so that we're providing these kind of safety nets as we go. So when we start to raise awareness at the bottom, you know, theme is mental health. Mental health means everything from good mental health all the way through to severe mental illness. So even what section of mental health is the theme? You know, I'm more than happy to provide you with a template, actually, Lorraine, which we use for campaign planning. So when you are campaign planning, sounds like you're about to run a campaign, it should be really well thought out, structured, reviewed and monitored as well. So I'm more than happy to send that out to you in an email.
And I was just going to add about asking people as well, isn't it, Emily? You know, asking the company. Not many people dare speak up sometimes, do they? But you might be surprised if you can do that in a really positive way, you know, of driving some kind of culture change. It's really good to get people's feedback, isn't it? So hopefully people will speak up.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I'll send you that out, Lorraine, and you can have a good look at it, and it'll help to take you through a really well thought out kind of campaign plan to help you to implement this kind of campaign safely and effectively as well. I think this one's for you, Rachel, from Maureen. What are challenges that safeguarding leads face now?
Okay, so I'm just trying to think what I've seen over the last sort of 12 to 18 months, but I think some of the major things can be the fact that it's quite a lonely role sometimes. You can be quite isolated or left as the sort of fluff of the business and then kind of just pulled upon for crisis, and it can be quite stressful. Of course, you know, I've been there and done that for several years. I've also worked in social work roles, so it's not easy. Is a challenge. I think the biggest piece of advice I can give in respect of that is to take care of yourself. Some safeguarding leads are very good at taking care of other people, but not themselves, and that creates burnout. And can be quite an awful place to be. However, if you are in a business that you are driving this forward, it's about you pushing forward in terms of that culture change. It's about being strong, it's about being passionate, and it's about, I always like to say, I like to leave people with the impression of increase. Every time I have a conversation with somebody, you know, whatever it is, leave them with an impression of increase, and they will always come back to you in some way, shape or form to seek further understanding. So I think that can be quite a nice way of trying to counteract some of that. But there can be a lot of things. Sometimes there isn't the right buy-in in the business. Sometimes a lot of the staff, you know, won't kind of follow the policies and procedures. So it's quite an onerous task, isn't it, when you're trying to drive that forward? So work with people, you know, get yourself out there, do some focus groups, speak to people, understand and seek to understand exactly where they're coming from, and try and drive it forward in the best way possible. I'm just trying to think of kind of what people have sort of said to me as well. I think a lot of people have been busy, very, very busy, is another challenge, but particularly around safeguarding and mental health, you know, and Emily can probably elaborate on that slightly. It can feel really comfortable for a safeguarding lead, a typical safeguarding lead, to be really great with abuse and all of these, you know, things that come across their lap, and they know all the legislation, all the guidance around it. But mental health can be quite a scary place because they might not have had the right training. So they've had everything, but we know, don't we, Emily, in the training we've had back in the day, you know, doing all of our different types of roles, it was there, we had some element, but we definitely didn't understand it to the point that we would have liked to. Do you know what I mean? We heavily on abuse, but mental health was kind of, it wasn't really provided for us, I don't think, anyway. In terms of my career, I've had to go out and do a lot of that myself. What's your thoughts?
I think just to add one to that, actually, with regards to challenges that safeguarding leads are facing now, is if you have safeguarding leads in your workplace and they're not part of your mental health first aid service in some way, you completely disconnecting them. And this is actually a huge problem, because it should be part and parcel of the same thing. It's about safeguarding people. Also, if you have LGBTQ champions, you know, disability champions, they should all be part of that whole kind of service structure. So by implementing this, the way that we look at our blueprint is about a service, a peer-to-peer support service. So no matter what that peer-to-peer support is, if you implement a very, very clear structure and infrastructure and policies and procedures in your service, it can actually protect everybody when it comes to your DSLs, mental health first aid, disability initiatives, LGBTQ initiatives. They should all actually be functioning under that same service blueprint. So, and I think that's what's happened. We've seen all these different movements, but they're not joined up, and they're not actually working together.
People work in silos, don't they?
Absolutely.
You know, by accident, and it just, you know, it then becomes the norm. So I totally appreciate that, 100%.
So we have another question, a couple of questions. We've got lots of questions. We have 2 minutes to go. So I think what I'll do is I'm going to just assume that people are going to leave in literally 1 minute. If you want to hang around to cover the questions that we're going to answer, that's absolutely great. I am going to also follow up with an email that will provide all of the resources that we've talked about today, and how you can contact Jack and Rachel directly. However, one of the things that we do is actually work together to help you to implement what we've done today. So we're not working in silo. Rachel understands our blueprint and how it fits in together. Obviously, Jack understands it and how the DBS checking and the safer recruitment processes all fit in with that. So we can actually work together. But I'll put all that details in an email. So thank you for attending today. And, you know, we are here to help if you need it. Feel free to leave. However, we can answer some of these questions. There's a question here around a great one that I saw actually about mental health and construction. I'm just trying to find it now. There it is, from Jane. So in regards to large male percent of the workforce, it's providing a barrier to breaking down that negative stigma, and how we can really push for an open culture in regards to mental health and safeguarding. So 2 weeks time, we've got Men's Health Week. So we are actually holding a free event similar to this, but it's based on men's mental health. So I will send the link in the email in case you'd like to book up for that. I think there's only a couple of spaces left, so it's probably worth being quick. I think one of the things when it comes to working within male-dominated workforces is we need to think about them as an audience and how we market to an audience. we need to understand men and their mental health to be able to also market to them in the right way. There are loads of myths around at the moment. I saw somebody post something on LinkedIn just yesterday, actually, saying, and it was a man, stop telling men to just talk about their feelings. And, you know, we hear this all the time. There is a lot of noise around mental health right now, and a lot of that noise is coming from people who actually don't know what they're talking about. Sorry, somebody had to say it. But what we, so a myth, just a myth for you, we hear this a lot. Well, men are more of a problem when it comes to their mental health because they die by suicide at such a high rate. And it's because they don't talk about their mental health. It's because they don't ask for help. This is actually a myth. And the research actually shows that women attempt suicide at a much higher rate than men do. Men just use means for suicide that are much quicker, leaves no opportunity or very little opportunity for intervention at that stage, and you know, are more violent. And when it comes to men not asking for help, this is again another myth. The research actually shows that 96% of people who've attempted suicide have actually been to their doctor within 6 months of attempting suicide, and that's men and women. So what we've actually seen is we see a lot of these myths being pushed towards men. And I'll use my husband as an example because he is like ex-army, pretty kind, he's an HGV driver, you know, proper blokey bloke. And, you know, sometimes I'll be sat and I'm like crying my eyes out going, why are you not crying? And, you know, I always remember one of the things that he first said to me, obviously in the early days of our relationship, when I was just getting to know him, and I'm saying, how are you not upset at watching that? He said, just because I'm not crying doesn't mean that I'm not feeling emotions. And I was like, wow, yeah, absolutely. You know, men and women are different when it comes to how we represent ourselves, how we show or don't show emotions, how we deal with our mental health. And there's a lot of health disparities around that. So if you want to really target males in your workforce, you need to do it properly. You know, that men are less likely to engage in kind of talking therapies, but maybe might find it more effective to engage in kind of practical activities around mental health. So, you know, setting up a five-a-side football game is probably more effective for men than actually telling them to ring the EAP. So it's about knowing your market. It's about really understanding what we're talking about when we're talking about mental health, and it is a specialist topic. So yeah, I think, you know, have a look along to our event. I'll send you the link to that, Jane, and you know, we can maybe catch on up again after that. Gosh, where can we get more practice and experience for help and support for the first aid to people? Where can we get more practice and experience for help and support for the first aid to people?
Good training, isn't it, really? A good training and a good strategy behind you to drive that forward, because you know, you might not get that, you may not come across anyone, you know, for a long time within your experience, and then you might have 10 people all at once. You know, it just depends, and it depends on how people want to speak to you and stuff like that. So I think from my perspective, a lot of very interactive training, a lot of scenario based stuff, a lot of stress testing policies can be really, really useful. So exercises, you know, team meetings where you're going to be doing this, and you know, you could go to the safeguarding team meetings and have discussions and do it that way. So a lot of, you know, role play, all of those types of things I think would be helpful.
Absolutely. And refresher training on a regular basis, ongoing development, so that you continue to practice your skills even though they're not actually face to face. One of the things that you know, you always fall back on is your training when it's done over and over and over again. And you know, being very, very clear on your processes means that if you know your process inside out, when it does happen, even if it hasn't happened for a year, you've still got that refreshed experience of understanding your processes in place and know what to do. So yeah, definitely, without a doubt, it's opportunities to practice, ongoing development, role play, and making sure that you continue to update your knowledge on the procedures around that. Yes, I'll send the template out. Thank you, I will do that. How would you deal with unsuitable mental health first aiders? One of the practices vulnerable people are taught is to put up boundaries. It is hard to open up and trust. If you've opened up to a mental health first aider and then found out they have betrayed your trust. So this is about your infrastructure, making sure that you're going through everything that we've talked about today so that it's very, very clear. You know, when mental health first aid goes wrong, it doesn't just take away the trust from that individual, it takes the trust away from the whole service. One of the things that a lot of groups of people may do in mental health first aid, and I've actually been sat in a team of mental health first aiders and heard it happen. They're actually in that, you know, that they get together on a regular basis. Yeah, I was talking to Bobby last week, you know, he was telling us all about the problems with it. You've just breached confidentiality. Like, you know, this is not, it's classed as discrimination under the Equality Act. So you need to have very, very clear guidance for people so that they understand what their boundaries are, because mental health first aiders also need to have boundaries in place to protect everyone.
That's what suitability is, isn't it? You know your people in your business that might not respect boundaries, and that for me is a biggie. Do you know what I mean? So be aware of that, guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Building trust to use mental health first aiders in the workplace in the first place is about making sure it's all done properly and that people understand the transparency of the service, that, you know, they're not there to keep secrets from people. You do have a safeguarding policy and procedure. You do have the ability to breach confidentiality in the right way if it needs to happen, so that people can actually build that trust. But you know, also, if you just put a mental health first aider on a 2-day mental health first aid course and they've then betrayed someone's trust, whose fault is that? Who was responsible for making sure that those mental health first aiders had everything that they needed to make sure that they were practicing safely?
It's huge. People don't understand the scale, do they? They don't understand that scale. Yeah. Which is why we wanted to come together, and hopefully we've delivered that, I hope.
Yeah, definitely. Honestly, thank you so much. Thanks Jack for you know, there's so many kind of questions on here. You know, I'll reach out on an email. I'll give everybody our contact details. Do get in touch. I am going to provide everybody with a link so that you can book in directly for a consultation as well for free. You know, this really is important to us that we keep everybody safe. So, you know, thank you very much for attending today, and we will follow up any other answers and questions in our emails. So thank you very much. Thank you for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks very much, guys. Absolute pleasure.